Reminded me of like a horror movie, you know, where like someone's chasing after you and you're like, I'm desperately needing the bag so that I can get all the water to come out, as you're just like being attacked violently by all the mosquitoes. And we didn't have head nets at the time because we didn't even really know. We thought they were for nerds. And it turns out that we are nerds and we didn't know that. Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
Today, we're continuing on with our Oregon Sampler Package series, as I like to call it. Today, we're going to talk about the table, which is actually our first time we ever backpacked off trail.
Yeah, and this is on the south side of Mount Jefferson in beautiful Oregon, an area that we hadn't explored all that much up until 2021 when we did our hike to the table. And kind of an intro to that area of Oregon for us was actually a couple weeks prior. We did a day hike starting at the Jefferson Lake Trailhead. And this area is interesting because it was affected by forest fires. And I don't know, was it in the early
2000s?
And so those fires took out a lot of, it took out a lot of trees, and I guess the Forest Service made a decision not to kind of go in and redo the trails. So a lot of areas became overgrown with something called snow brush.
Yeah. So in essence, basically this area was, in my understanding, managed by the Bend Forest Service.
So is that Deschutes?
Yeah, like Deschutes County. And so they basically had a decision to make as trail usage increased with the trails around Bend of what they could fund and what they couldn't fund. And so they ended up funding a lot more trails around Bend versus trying to rebuild all the trails in the Mount Jefferson wilderness.
And so, yeah, it's an interesting area. I don't know if we were just looking at all trails trying to find, something different to do. Another pro for that area is at least the Jefferson Lake Trail, the snow melts a lot faster than on the west side of Mount Jefferson. So we got out there, I think it was in May, and had snow-free trail. And then there's a group called Save Our East Cascade Trails. And so they have a Facebook page if you wanted to check that out. They work on maintaining and kind of improving the use of those trails on the eastern side, which is really beautiful country. It's not as trafficked due to the burn.
Geologically, it's so fascinating, that whole area. But one thing that's just interesting is if you volunteer at all with Save Our East Cascade Trails, you can get in your volunteer hours to help you not have to get permits for the permit system. So that's something worth looking up if you live in Oregon. But the interesting thing about the Jefferson Lake Trail is it was almost completely lost until a couple decided to do their own trail maintenance. Basically, they got approval that they could maintain the first 1/4 mile of trail, and then they could maintain more and more. And they actually have maintained it up to the point that you can reach Jefferson Lake, which is a really lovely subalpine lake near Mount Jefferson.
And fascinatingly enough, the 2020 wildfires that hit the Jefferson wilderness actually burned around Jefferson Lake. When we did that hike in 2021, when we got close to the lake, all of a sudden all the trees were, charred and black, and the ground was loose and unstable, and it was fascinating. Just that one part was affected by the fires, but the rest of the trail was untouched.
But when you looked at the fire map, it actually said it hadn't gone there, which I thought was so interesting. And I think it's just such a forgotten piece of the Mount Jefferson wilderness. And you might say, well, then why would you bring any attention to it? Well, it's because actually they encourage people to get out and recreate on that side. It takes some of the pressure off of those very, very popular trails in the Bend and Mount Jefferson area. It deserves that foot traffic because it's beautiful and very cool. And the more foot traffic you get, the less difficulty they have maintaining it. So that's just an aside, but we kind of got that introduction to that area that way.
And one other piece to talk about the Jefferson Lake Trail. If you wanted to see a very cool old growth tree, it's within, I want to say, maybe a 1/4 mile of the trailhead. They had to it fell down in a storm, and they had to cut it out so that they could, have access for the trail to go through. And I want to say that tree must be 6 feet high, just in diameter. I don't know. Anyways, just
6 feet high. That's not impressive.
Very cool to see how that area, it looks so arid now, but it was old growth forests prior to the fire. So that was kind of us getting accustomed to the area on a day hike. However, we had learned about this area called the Table on that south side of Mount Jefferson years prior when we hung out with some friends, and their dad actually talked about how...
And these are friends that Molly made on the side of a mountain.
Yes, these are friends from the South Sister, the Whistlers. So we were hanging out with them, and their dad had done a lot of hiking in the Mount Jefferson wilderness, had climbed all the Oregon Cascade volcanoes, I believe. And he was telling us about this beautiful place that he had hiked in, I think, maybe the 80s. Showed me some pictures, like, on a slideshow. And Carrie wasn't there, so I went back and told her, hey, there's this area on the south side of Jefferson called The Table. It's really cool. And I think that this was back in 2018.
Yeah.
So
we had basically just started hiking back in 2018, so we had very little experience, and I always kind of was hoping that someday we'd be able to do off-trail stuff, but obviously I knew we were going to have to build up our skills. But I would say I spent the next 3 years, honestly, just researching the table, learning about how it was formed. It's very cool. It's like basically a dome that's flat on top, and they say that that is because when there were so many eruptions happening around Mount Jefferson, which is a volcano, that those domes formed by erupting underneath an ice sheet that was very thick. And so
cool.
I know. And so that is kind of why they're shaped the way they are. And they're basically kind of scalped flat sort of from that glaciation. And it's why they're so flat on top is because they burst out through the ice sheet, which is just really neat. Also, I love going to places that are a little bit less trafficked, that are quieter. And so I think that was just why it was such a huge goal for us to be able to go there someday. So it seems like, it may seem to people like, oh, they just went out there. But the thing you have to know is for off-trail, it takes a lot of research. Mm-hmm. And I read every trip report I can find. There's not that many. I read trip reports for other trails that people went on nearby. I just looked at pictures on the internet that people had taken. I looked at satellite photos. I didn't have access to it at the time, but you can look at maps that have basically gradient shading to see how steep a trail would be, or how steep a area off trail would be if you were trying to go up to it. And I kind of formulated that plan based on looking at all those things. And I think that this is one of those backpacking trips that I'm so proud of because it was one that we researched and I researched and planned and put together and executed. And this is actually, I feel like recently our podcasts have been like, we tell the stories where we don't make it to the end. And I do think that's so important. And I'm proud of us still for going out there. But this is one that actually we were able to execute. And I feel like it just built so much confidence for me, and not only off trail, but also just like the fact that I can plan a route and effectively execute it. And so this was like one of those exciting moments, and I can't wait to take you guys along on this journey because I mean, this again is an area where there's so many different campsites that are established along the way where you don't have to go up onto the table, because that was kind of the crux of this whole trip. Crux meaning like the most difficult portion. And so you don't have to do that piece of it, but I would say that if you're someone who lives in the Oregon or Washington area and you're just like tired of going to crowded trailheads and crowded lakes and crowded forests and you want to get away, this is kind of a little bit more of a drive. And it's still permitted, so it's not like you could still have a million people there, but you might have a better chance at getting a permit, and it's just totally worth the attention and the time. But we're definitely looking forward to talking about our trip to the table.
And one more note on the geography, Carrie. I always thought of the table as a plateau, and it's kind of stepped, right? There's a lower table and then the upper table. But is it technically a plateau, or is it something else?
No, it is technically. I mean, I think a plateau, doesn't that just mean that it's flat on top?
Yeah.
But okay, there is another word that I've been reading that's called a toya. And I can't find out if it is actually accurately a geographical term for that spot. I was trying to read a paper before this that was published by a geologist at like the Oregon I think OSU, and it was really interesting. And that was where I was reading that actually there's considered to be three flat mesas, not mesas, three. There's plateaus? Actually three plateaus, and I'm not really sure which one the third one is because I don't know if they consider that cinder cone to be part of the tables, because they were referring to it as north, middle, and south table. And at first I thought they were talking about a different geographical area, but this is 1 mile north, 1 mile northwest of Patsy Lake. And I'm like, no, that's totally accurate for the location.
Fascinating.
But then they also talked about the area that on the side of the table where it's just that sheer cliff. And basically it was such an interesting article, and I need to read more, but it talked about the formation of that and how it erupted through the ice sheet. And honestly, You're probably going to get tired of us talking about geology on this one because this trail has so many cool segments. There's like a segment where the forked butte lava flow comes and it meets up with a different piece of the trail. Like it's right where it stopped, and you get to walk between a lava flow, and there's like the huge boulders, and on the other side it's a talus slope, and it's just like, this is an unbelievably interesting geologically trail, and also it's stunning because Mount Jefferson's there and there were wildflowers, and I just am like, how do more people not go there?
And we were also talking on our Timberline Trail series about how it's hard to find areas in Oregon that are really those subalpine climates. I think you go to Washington and there are just so many places that kind of emulate that subalpine vibe. But in Oregon, it's not quite so frequent. So the north side of Mount Hood was one place where there's a lot of heather. The trees are more of that subalpine type of tree. And then this area, as you're journeying towards the table, you actually end up hiking at about 6,000 feet for a while. So there's a lot of heather. The trees just take on that different look, and the climate and environment is different, and it's just very beautiful. And I remember when we were walking through it, I thought, this reminds me of being in Washington, and then it spits you out into this volcanic environment. So then you don't really get that in Washington as much. The places I've been with lava flows and such, which obviously we think Mount St. Helens, etc., they do exist, but it just is a very diverse area. And our hike started from the Cabot Lake trailhead, and so we took an 11-mile route to get all the way up onto the table. So fascinating how 11 miles can take you through so much different terrain.
So without further ado, the table.
Our trip to the table was actually our second backpacking trip in 2022, and it was a relatively low snow year in the Oregon Cascades, which meant that we completed this trip in the second week of July. So, of course, there's a couple different complexities with that we'll get to as we go through the podcast, one of which is mosquitoes. But we were, planning and trying to figure out which trailhead we wanted to start from, because we could start from the Jefferson Lake trailhead, but we just done that hike. And then there's
also, I believe the connector trail was not maintained at that time. So it was actually, and I'm not sure if it is now or not. I need to research that and get back to you guys.
Interesting.
But the connector trail, they had done up to Jefferson Lake at that time, and I believe they've cleared up to Cabot now, or Carl.
No, the connector trail would go up to Table Lake itself, I think.
Okay, but it was not cleared at that time.
Okay.
And we had considered that because we were like, we could just do a really big off-trail experience, and then we were like, we don't got time for that.
Yes. And so we'd started we kicked off our backpacking by doing a Thursday-Friday trip on the west side of Mount Jefferson. I think that totaled about 25 miles in 2 days. And then we were going to follow it up with 2 more days of backpacking on the east side. So we were going to do 4 days in a row and hit like just over 40 miles, I think.
Well, we had one night at home.
Exactly. So anyways, what I'd been watching for the week preceding this trip was the kind of reading trip reports on all trails for people who were day hiking, just to see what the snow situation was like, to see if we could actually make this trip work. So I think that, were there permits required at this point in 2021? No. So we decided we would start at Carl Lake because it was about 11 miles up to the table from there. And so I was watching basically every day reading trip reports, and it was interesting because the one section of trail that goes about 6,000 feet of elevation was an area that was pretty snowed in a week prior to our departure, but we had some hot weather and things just started melting. And so I think the last time I checked before our trip began was maybe on Friday. We were going to start on Saturday afternoon, and it said that it was snow free, and we really didn't encounter any real significant snow to be a barrier to the hike.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we started kind of a little bit later in the afternoon because I don't know if we already mentioned this, but we went to church that day in the morning, and then we were going to meet our friend Rachel. She also was coming backpacking with us at this point. This was actually before we did the Wallowas, so prior to when we have all beaten ourselves up. But she came with us on this trail as well. So we met her at the trailhead, and ironically, of course, we went to that trailhead, and the most annoying thing in the world is when you have to poop at a trailhead and there's no toilet. And so just heads up, there's no toilet at this trailhead. So come prepared. But fortunately, I already knew how to dig a cat hole, so that worked out just fine for me.
And it was a warm day. I think that when we looked at our itinerary, we started at about 2:30 p.m. And so we were kind of going in the heat of the afternoon, but we just did what we could to make it work for us. So once we all kind of congregated at the trailhead, people who needed to dig cat holes had dug their cat holes. We set off knowing we had, a good 11 miles of hiking, and I think the sun set at about 9:30 p.m., which is a nice advantage of July as you get a lot of daylight.
Yeah, so basically we just started out, and honestly, the trail I remember being pretty nice. There was a couple blowdowns that we had to step across. Nothing major. The switchbacks were pretty nice. One issue that this area has really bad is there's a lot of something called snowbrush. There's a different scientific name for it, which I will not say here today because I don't remember it.
It's like
and I think so. And so what happens is when there was a catastrophic fire, I think that was a 2002 B&B complex fire, they call it, and at the time it was one of the most massive fires that had ever happened. Like the president even came and visited because it was so unbelievable. Yeah. Obviously there's been much larger wildfires now, but it burned a huge swath of forest. And so when that happens, it kind of it changes the landscape, right? So prior to that, there were these trees that provided shade. And then now there's no trees providing shade. And snowbrush is kind of one of those first things that can come in and just grow super well because it loves the sun. It does not like the shade. And so it can grow and actually kind of choke out that new growth, which I think that after more recent wildfires, they've started planting trees after the fires. Because prior to that, they would say, okay, well, these trees will just regrow. But we hadn't been dealing with like that large of wildfires before, where it was burning out whole swaths of forest. So they planted some of them to try and cut down on that growth of the snowbrush. But when snowbrush grows, it's really frustrating for trails because it you can't just bushwhack through it, right? And it grows thick and you can't see anything. This trail had been really nicely cleared of snowbrush, but we definitely could see it as we went along the trail. And the Jefferson Lake Trail is one that they have to always be cutting back the snowbrush on as well.
And I remember when we first started our hike, like the first mile of trail, you're kind of on a ridge and then you drop down towards Cabot Lake. And so on the ridge, you'd think you'd have the view around you, but sometimes you're in the snowbrush so much that all you can really see is the snowbrush. Yeah. But fortunately, the trail was pretty wide the way they had maintained it.
It's like a little maze, but you just stay on the trail. There's not a lot of extra paths.
Exactly.
And that is one more thing I do want to just harp on is if you are going to do off trail in the Jefferson Wilderness on the southeast side, you need to really research and be wise about which trail you choose. There are some trails that have been so lost to the snowbrush that they like beg people, do not go on these trails because you might make it not even a mile every couple of hours. They're so thick and you can't see anything. Our off trail did not take us through any snowbrush overgrowth areas. Yeah. So I would say please pay attention to signage. If it says please do not go on this trail because there have been many rescues, don't go on that trail.
Do you remember which trail it was where it wasn't Bear Valley, I don't think, but there was a story of two people who had tried to take this trail as a cutoff, and it is a non-maintained trail. I think even we've walked past where that trail would be, and I'm pretty sure the sign says do not go here. And I think, didn't you say it took them like 3 days to go like 3 miles or something ridiculous?
It was something ridiculous where they actually were like one group that didn't have to be rescued, but they were like, we have to warn everyone because this is something where you have to also pay attention to trails, especially after wildfires. We met a group of gals one time doing a trail that hadn't been maintained since before a 2017 wildfire, and they'd flown in, they hadn't known about it, they had read on All Trails reviews, but no one had reviewed and said, this trail has been closed for 3 years. It does not exist anymore. It's essentially just a bare cliff face now that's crumbling. Yeah. So I know that that's a tangent, but I get to say tangents because it's my podcast. So anyway, we kind of descended to Cabot Lake, and I thought that was just fine lake. But Carl Lake was the one that I thought was super impressive. Wasn't that one that had like the cliffs behind it that we had to go up? Mm-hmm. That was super cool.
And so we stopped at Carl Lake for just a couple minutes and kind of enjoyed, just a rest break for our legs because I think that was probably 5 miles in or so. And that's when we first got our real introduction to the just hordes of mosquitoes for this trip. And I don't know, that became the theme of this trip, unfortunately, was mosquitoes. Mm-hmm. I remember we stopped at Carl Lake and we thought, well, we'll just sit here for a minute. And as soon as we sat down on the lakeshore, the mosquitoes were just like, whoosh. And so I remember I have a picture of Carrie. She's actually sitting on some rocks, like in the lake, because if you're like further into the lake, somehow the mosquitoes weren't really as present as they were in the woods. So we did everything we could to try to get rid of them. And it was funny because like hiking between Cabot Lake and Carl Lake, there's a couple little swampy areas and you'd know that you were close to water because it would just be like all these mosquitoes descending upon you.
So one thing I'd say is we definitely made good time on this trail that day, even though it was kind of warm. Honestly, we were hiking on the peak of the day and then as it cooled off. Yeah. So it started to cool off. We reached this really incredible, so you go up basically those switchbacks behind Carl Lake. Yeah. And I remember reading about people being like, oh, I counted them. There's so many. It's so unpleasant. And I did not count them and I thought they were fine. Yeah. And it's kind of a burnout area. So of course it's a little hotter and all that kind of stuff. But once you get over that, then you kind of end up hiking in some really fascinating terrain. There's beautiful forest, some of it burned, some of it unburned. And then you get to these parts that are so cool. You get to this talus slope that, like I said earlier, runs into the lava flow of the North Fork. And so on one side, you have like these white sort of cliffy type things. On the other side, you have this wall of what was formerly lava that's got to be at least 50 feet tall. And I took a picture of Molly standing next to it. And then eventually you pop out onto this plain where you can see like all of the wilderness ahead of you. We could see the tables. We could see the way that they rise up out of the ground, the almost gorge that's around them. We could see the cinder cone, which is beautiful and stunning. There's a place called Bear Butte that you can see. We got to see Mount Jefferson from the south, and I have a video that I was looking at of where I was talking, and I was just like, this is so cool to me because I had only seen it so many times on Google Maps or on a satellite or on an attempted 3D image, and it was like, now I get to see it myself, and it's so much better in person. And it was just stunning. Like that plane, we had to stop and take some pictures, and it's fascinating because I don't know if it's like a lighter pumice or something there, but the ground was so soft. And there was all these beautiful little flowers that were growing around. And so it was just a really cool area to walk through. Yeah. But there was a funny moment.
Yeah, right before we broke out onto that open area with the view, we were just walking along in single file, and all of a sudden we heard this loud noise, like a drrrr, I don't even know. It really scared all of us. I feel like our hearts skipped a beat and we kind of like rushed to the edge of the forest. And I think it might have been a bird. It wasn't the same of the whoompa 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 that we talked about a while back.
Shout out to one of our awesome listeners, Tom, who didn't he put a video that had the similar sound and it was a bird. So thanks, Tom.
Some type of an owl, really. But it was something much louder. And in my mind, I thought it was the roar of a lion, which mountain lions don't even roar. So, but yeah, we were really scared, but Rachel was there. And for some reason, especially when Carrie and I were like, just, I don't know, experiencing more like being into the more remote wilderness areas, there's something about adding another person to the mix that just makes you feel even that much safer. And Rachel made us feel so safe. I don't know why.
She could protect us with her knife.
Yeah. Oh gosh. This is before she cut her finger.
Yeah. So eventually you drop down into this really incredible area, which is the Table Lake area. And that is a fully spring-fed lake, is my understanding. Guys, this is like one of the most unbelievable, beautiful, clear lakes you will ever see. And there are established campsites. You can camp there. Yeah. We were not planning to camp there because we were going to go up to the table. But I would say if there's one recommendation I have, do not do it right after the snow melts because we were being eaten alive by mosquitoes. So we had to filter all this extra water because when you camp on top of the table, it is a dry camp. We knew that there was snow melting, so we knew there was a possibility of some water being up there, but why rely on that? So we were all going to carry extra water. So we're refilling all of our 3-liter water bladders, which we drank a lot of water because it's hot. We're filling extra bags with water. We're like doing all this work. And I just remember that honestly, it reminded me of like a horror movie, where like someone's chasing after you and you're like, I'm desperately needing the bag so that I can get all the water to come out as you're just like being attacked violently by all the mosquitoes. And we didn't have head nets at the time because we didn't even really know. We thought they were for nerds. And it turns out that we are nerds and we didn't know that. But so we're all just like frantically, trying to filter water. And then it's kind of was like, okay, this is where the off-trail stuff begins.
And I do have to make one note, is that we walked past because Table Lake, I believe there's lower and upper Table Lakes. So we walked past lower Table Lake, and then upper Table Lake is the part that it is just crystal clear blue water. It is absolutely gorgeous. And that's where we ended up filling up our water. And as Carrie said, just the haste with which we were doing it, it felt unreal. Like we were being chased by murderers, but the murderers were the mosquitoes. And it was wild. We used mosquito spray. I don't know. It's like everyone has something different, right? People talk about soaking clothes in permethrin, just like wearing a lot of clothes. I don't know. And it's hot. It's just hard to like keep a lot of layers on for us. So we were, liberal with the mosquito spray and still just like being eaten alive. It was wild.
But the one big negative is we only brought, I believe, 1.5 cans of mosquito spray for 3 people. And I think in our group chat, we were like, that should be plenty for one night, right? We did not think about how it's actually kind of not enough for when the mosquitoes are absolutely going bonkers. Exactly. So basically, the off-trail part of the table, we saw there's and I'm not going to give too many details because if you want to do this trail, you can either reach out to us or you can do your own research. But since it's off trail, I'm not going to give you like a step-by-step, that's part of the fun. But basically there's a place where it's divided lower down and you can basically just, it's like a wash where you can just see the route up. And one thing that we were keeping in mind, of course, on this route is you're always looking to try and figure out where you're going to land above you because there's a lot of areas where you could be cliffed out. So you'd have to backtrack. And we didn't want to have to backtrack because it was, of course, getting to be evening due to the way that we plan things. But it was such an interesting area. So at first it's kind of like these boulders that are of a decent size, but you can just walk from boulder to boulder, obviously being careful with your footing because there's like holes and there's grass. And then as you got higher, there was almost some mild climbing, I would say, where you're pulling yourself up on roots. There was like a more major step, right, where we had to pull ourselves up and over and use the tree, but you can't also always commit to a tree. And so that was really fun, honestly, the route finding. And I think this was a really good area to do off trail at first because it is so open. So you can always kind of see where you are.
And it's interesting, Carrie mentioned, the climbing that you do. It is a fun amount and it's, I don't even know if I could class it or anything like that. But the part that's a little complicated is that there's a decent amount of vegetation. Mm-hmm. So you'd be like trying to pull yourself up and over, a taller rock. And then there's a tree just like ready to just stab you in the face. So it's just this kind of mixture of like navigating the rock, but also navigating the vegetation. And in my memory, it didn't feel like it took us a ton of time to make the trek, but I think it was about 500 feet of gain. And I don't know if it was
at least an hour.
Okay. And I'll look it up while we chat here. But yeah, something about 500 feet of gain.
Yeah. And so basically, I do remember that same experience where I vividly remember being pulling up onto a ledge and being pushed off of the ledge also by the vegetation. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And of course, you're also having to deal with the fact that you have a backpack. We had our trekking poles out because there were some sections that trekking poles were great because you come up to like this area where it's almost maybe more of like a mini hanging basin. So like a very tiny version of that, where all of a sudden it's just kind of like a gravelly uphill transition. And I think we just kind of formed our own little switchbacks into the hills because it was very steep.
And so I actually didn't get how much time it took us, but it's about 500 feet of elevation over a third of a mile. So that's pretty darn respectable. And it looks like it took us about, honestly, Carrie, it only took us like 40 minutes-ish. Maybe.
Well, then why did it feel like an hour? I'm just kidding. I would say that if I was to class this, I would say it's a climber's trail because whenever you read that something's a climber's trail, you can kind of more expect to have that uphill where some of it's almost semi-vertical, you know what I mean? Like you are doing steps up and all that kind of stuff.
And then the one piece there too, because we've done other climbers trails in Washington, is lots of times that involves a footpath, but at no point do I remember there being a footpath with this trail. So that's where it is kind of a fun, making your own adventure, route finding. It was really a really cool experience for us. At one point then, as we got towards the end of our time in that wash climbing upwards, there was one area where it split off and there was kind of like 2 washes, and we were on like the south one, and then there was one on the north side, and we did stop and make a little bit of a geotag there and take a picture because one of them, it looked like you could start going down it, but then there's like a lot of trees and it looked like it got kind of cliffy. So we just wanted to make sure that when we wanted to leave, we actually knew where we were going and gave ourselves a breadcrumb trail of sorts so that we could get down safely.
Yeah, and it was nice because we were tracking all of this on our watches, so then we did have a little bit of access to kind of pay attention to where we were. Although I think the one fault of the watch that we have is you can't look at it after you close out of it, so we wouldn't have been able to use it the next day, right? But anyway, once we finally popped up onto the top, we made another mark of where we exited because we wanted to be able to find it again. And I will say one thing that's fascinating about the table is I feel like you could have 100 people up there and never even see them. And you could all come up there and you all would probably end up exiting, like the wash at different points. And camping in different places because it's just this flat expanse and it's not that treed, but somehow it's also treed enough that you can't see everything.
Yeah.
So it was just like really cool where it felt so private. I'm sure we were the only people out there, but it really, really felt like you're alone.
And really, it felt like, I don't know, when we went to the top of Half Dome, it just felt like the surface of the moon to me, like such a foreign environment that was so cool and different. And in a way, the table felt kind of like the surface of the moon as well. Carrie had mentioned the trail that we had walked on that first plateau being kind of that soft volcanic soil, and that's basically what the table is as well. And just it just was a fascinating place. There were kind of grasses and like lichens on the soft soil, and then I don't think we had seen any little tarns or little lakes at that point, but we kind of did some discovering of some the following day. But yeah, we just found a nice spot with a couple trees, a flat area, durable surface to pitch our tents. And then did we have chocolate milk with us at this point? Yeah. So we found an area of snow. So we went and threw our Fairlife chocolate milks in there to chill them out for our delicious milk time. And then we just honestly sat there and enjoyed just a front row seat to the south side of Mount Jefferson as one of those very typical kind of mellow Oregon sunsets occurred, but it was beautiful.
And one of my favorite things about the south side of Mount Jefferson is there's this glacier that's called the Waldo Glacier. And that year, because it was such a low snow year, it was super bare. But if you look at it, it literally looks like there's eyes, a mouth, and a hand that's waving at you. So if you can see me on the video podcast, it looks like this. And I loved looking at that. I feel like I was just always laughing because it's the Waldo Glacier and it's like, where's Waldo? And then there he is. He's waving at you. Hello. But yeah, we definitely enjoyed a beautiful dinner. The mosquitoes I think it was kind of windy. So the mosquitoes weren't going gangbusters.
What we had to do, we cooked in one place, and then at the end of our time cooking, the mosquitoes had found us, and then we walked to another area to eat our meal. And so it seemed like it took them like 10 or 15 minutes to find you. So that's what we did. We had to be kind of like mobile as we were eating to kind of keep the mosquitoes behind us a little bit.
And we were also able to take some really pretty pictures of like the mountain and our tents once the sun went down. But I would say overall, this was just such a good day because it was a good day for building confidence, for building some off-trail skills, and for just navigating in an unfamiliar type of terrain. And obviously this is a fragile environment, so you don't want to be building fires. You don't want to be, getting all these weird off-trail paths. But again, I think it was such a cool experience to be able to go up there and just enjoy that beautiful night. And I will say, of course, in the back of my mind is always the fear of like, what if we can't get back down? But it was nice to negate some of that with our marking of locations and that kind of stuff. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode about the table, and that if you did enjoy it, that you'd be willing to rate or review our podcast on the platform of your choice. And if you want to see any pictures or videos of this beautiful area, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures.
Bye.